Hello, Tom Lowe here, Director of Civic by Design. And I was asked to prepare a recorded version of a talk I gave to the restoration housing folks in Roanoke, Virginia in September of 2023. It's a fun talk, and it's really focused around the idea of missing middle. But we get into a few other fun things like visual preferencing, community, um, kind of stepping back and looking at the big picture of urban design and community making, and then really get into some of the details of the history of Roanoke. So here we go. I'll take you through it and I hope you enjoy it. First, I'd like to talk about the kind of the big picture scale of two, potentially similar urban planning models, but if you look at them more closely, they're really completely different. Um, there's been a great kind of urban planning experiment, 20th century experiment, which is just winding down, fortunately, that was designed around the car. We call that autocentric sprawl. It's very different. It may have, similar ingredients in terms of what makes up community, but the way it's put together is entirely different, as opposed to the historic walkable sustainable villages and neighborhoods in towns and cities throughout the world that were designed at the increment of human beings and walkability. And you can see this image of this beautiful village, walkable village, that, there's so many of them as you fly across the country and in other countries. You see these intact, they're thriving, and they offer an incredible quality of life. Now, related to that, let's go down to the ground. This is a visual preference survey that I typically do, and we ask the audience to have a show of hands between these two images. As to reference these are both images have the same size house on the same size lot, but you can see they are designed entirely differently in terms of physical form. Show of hands, how many people would prefer to live in the top image? And then a show of hands, how many people prefer to live in the bottom image? I think it's unanimous. People prefer the bottom image because they get the idea of what makes places more inviting in terms of community and connecting with your neighbor and the walkability and basically the quality of the space in terms of landscape and street trees and shade trees and so forth. Now, that was easy, but if you take that same preferred image and then compare it to maybe another version with the same size house, same size lot, that's designed for more walkability and traffic calming and increased green space, what is the show of hands here? Well, interesting. The majority of folks prefer the bottom image. What's interesting about this is that in most places in North America, the bottom image is illegal in terms of current zoning and current infrastructure standards. So that's where the challenge comes in. And as you move further along in terms of sustainability and basically how you can create places that are woven into nature versus dominating over it, you can see these two comparative images and then the preference again in terms of where you'd like to live. What's interesting is the show of hands shows about 2/3 on the top image and about 1/3 on the bottom, which is typical. And that really kind of reveals people's passion for sustainability. I kind of talk about this being the top image is kind of light green and the bottom image represents folks that are deep green. And it's not a matter of choosing one or the other. You can have both. And in fact, the image on the top is from a master plan of mine, the village of Habersham in South Carolina. And the bottom image is a new town in Oklahoma called Carlton Landing. What's interesting is in Carlton Landing, these boardwalk streets with natural drainage and landscaping, every other one is more like the street on the top image. So you have both. And what's fun is people can choose, the deep green can live on the bottom street, the light green can live on the top street. And what's fun is, like people say, you don't want to eliminate one or the other because, for example, the folks on the bottom image, they throw the best parties and the neighbors on the top image love coming over and hanging out. So that's what creates community, is that variety and choice. Now, how do you calibrate a place? Well, that's what we do. That's what I do professionally. I give advice. What you typically do is to find places within a community that resonate in terms of, what works and what people enjoy and offers a quality of life, high quality of life. This was pointed to us, as many people think, is the pretty street in Roanoke, Virginia, Greenwood Road. And you can see it kind of combines the best of many that I just presented, where the street is narrow enough that it's traffic calmed, not too wide. It doesn't have a huge abundant shade, and green space, walkability, and really nice houses, deeper setbacks, but typical size house lots as well. So you see, that's how we figure things out in terms of how we plan places. Now, how do we distinguish between the two, and how do we help champions the ones that work better? Well, this is a good comparison between two plans for the same site. The top image and the bottom image are on about 70 acres, and it's basically a small village, coastal village. And you can see the 5-minute walk radius on the bottom. This is a famous town called Seaside. It's a resort town in Florida, and it was designed with this plan. But at the same time, all across the Florida Panhandle, the rest of the development was happening in this suburban sprawl fashion, where you can see the real estate industry calls these price points. You have a lot of range of housing choice. You have rental apartments, you have starter housing, move up, executive housing, and then you have downsizing. These are kind of the condos on that kind of block off the views and the access, which is very typical in coastal places like Panama City. And this model, yes, you do have a mixed income, mixed housing choice, you do have mixed use, but you can see it's detailed and within a 5-minute walk theoretically, but it's detailed in a way that people don't necessarily want to walk. In fact, it's almost impossible. A person that lives here could theoretically walk to lunch here in the Strip Shopping Center, but because they have to walk out onto an arterial collector road that's high speed, doesn't have sidewalks, then basically trying to negotiate that makes it impossible. So that's the kind of thing that you try to avoid, this kind of coarse grain development pattern. Even though it does provide for a variety of different pods, it doesn't offer a human scale connection, which makes a big difference, as opposed to this. Now, this is basically the same number of lots and different sizes, and the same amount of commercial and mixed use are basically here. The ingredients are exactly the same. It's just how you arrange them. You can see in a traditional block, you have small, medium, and large lots. You have mixed use. The green space here is a form of buffers, kind of residual buffers, and these kind of retention pits. I call them asteroid craters for stormwater management. Where here, the green space is civic in nature. It's gathering places, pocket parks, boulevards, outdoor areas, park space, natural areas. And actually the village green, the town green, is actually a large retention area that comes in the form of an amphitheater, which is the destination of really that whole coastal area. So you can see how you can do things differently. What's interesting is that back in 1983, I think, when it was planned and everything else was going in this direction, this became so interesting and so appealing that it became the poster child for, publications like Southern Living magazine, and really kind of took off as a place, a destination, and ever since then has been incredibly successful. Now, that's an interesting model, kind of a starting point. What's also interesting is the designers of this, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, basically as young architects, came up with that idea, and then the development industry back in the late 80s looked at it and said, this is so successful, why don't we try to apply this to the development industry, as opposed to, say, the kind of the Hilton Head-esque golf course communities that are designed around cars. And so some of the early adopter developers got together and sponsored some master planning projects. And one of them, called the Kentlands, original Kent Farm in Gaithersburg, Maryland, there was a development team, a group that sponsored it. And one of the things that came out of this was a process that engaged the community so that the community could design it together with the designers. And they said, let's do it in a feedback loop workshop that was kind of, architects called a charrette, French term. And it was so interesting that the New York Times sent a reporter down and documented the 7 days of designing a new traditional town. This got so much attention that it really created a huge amount of momentum for the opportunity to say, listen, we have enough suburban sprawl. We're tired of it. It's really eroding all of our communities. It's gobbling up all of our open space and farms. And we really need to come up with a better model that's more compact and livable. And that's what happened. And that's where I came into the picture, because I was an architect practicing in Charlotte and designing a lot of buildings that I thought were great, but they were all sitting in parking lots. And I got disillusioned with the architectural profession, and there really wasn't, that any momentum around changing. So I looked around, and through the advice of some really smart people, got pointed to Andres and Liz's work, and they just started an urban design program, master's program at the University of Miami that my wife had just gotten recently married, and we decided to kind of go for it and go down and get our master's in urban design and architecture, as well as hers, and MFA in art history. It was great experience. And before I even graduated, Andres and Liz said, hey, we need some help with this. We've got a lot of work, and you kind of have experience, you're grown up, and you can help us. And I said, great. So we joined together and we hit the ground running, and ended up with a career over 200 charrettes for communities all over North America and in other countries. Along the way, a lot of things happened. We needed some very important frameworks to explain and to implement these. And so we came up with things like the simple set of standards. I'm not going to go through these. You can look at these, but basically we talked a lot about the difference between land use patterns, autocentric suburban sprawl, and then also walkable neighborhoods, and how connectivity and convenience and embedding mixed uses in a walkable setting can make a huge amount of difference. In this case, this model on the top compared to this model on the bottom reduces traffic generation between 1/3 and 2/3 car trips a day. They're all internal, and elderly and kids can walk here, where they're actually, basically have to be shuttled or chauffeured around by families or vans and so forth like that. Now, just as a reference, I'd like to show you some of my favorite within this area of the country. There are some beautiful, incredible, successful communities all over the place, but some that are kind of nearby. This is the village of Habersham in South Carolina, between Charleston and Savannah. And it was designed as a village that was woven into an existing live oak forest, basically. The trees had grown out of 2 fallow farms over 150 years. And instead of bulldozing the trees, we basically wove the community through the tree canopies you can see here. And if there was a tree in the way, we didn't knock it down. We just went around it. Simple things like that. And really having that kind of model and that kind of idea made a big difference. In other places, the character of the architecture and how you work with landforms, like, in mountainous areas, like this is the village of Cheshire in Black Mountain, North Carolina, near Asheville. You can see we're picking up on incredible vistas and views, natural areas, laying lightly on the land, by working with topography versus leveling things out. The bridges are designed as, in this case, like a washover bridge, where we're not putting a huge amount of infrastructure in. We're kind of keeping things, respecting the character of the place. And it turned out quite beautifully, inspired by the tradition in the mountains of arts and crafts, architecture, and really interesting models like this tree house as a type, and beautiful crafted details like their street lighting and signage and so forth. And also some really interesting models that have certain themes. Like this is the village of Ion in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, right next to Charleston. As you can see, it's very much of Charleston in terms of the historic architecture and urban character. And in this case, we were able to take two basically former borrow pits for coastal sand beach reconstitution and turn them into a couple of beautiful urban lakes, and also connect them with some wonderful canals with housing along the canals, and you can see the architecture is exquisite here. This is a beautiful, incredibly successful community in the Charleston area. Now, and then not only just kind of these new larger communities, but also working strategically within cities, doing urban redevelopment and basically community engaging a community to help repair places that have fallen on hard times. This is the area called Southside, right next to downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. Sadly, this area of a neighborhood was severed from the larger neighborhood by an urban renewal era highway. You can see kind of the pit going across here in this rendering. And so this kind of fragment of a neighborhood, about 12 acres, really started deteriorating significantly. It's along Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, and really needed a lot of help. Our master plan for this really looked at how we could revitalize and revalue the existing housing stock, and also things like local businesses, like the old live work units like these. What we did is we restored the existing houses. We did new infill houses with similar architecture and character. We also created new live work units that are similar enough to the historic ones that these revalued these, and them were then renovated and remodeled. Oh yes, these actually do have value. Let's rescue them and repair them. And you can see here, it became a theme for the core, the heart. What's also interesting is there was basically an exit ramp off of this urban renewal highway that we turned into a community green, which is a wonderful transformation. This was just an off ramp that came crashing down into a neighborhood, and we stopped it, slowed it down, and created a new center, a new heart to this community for Southside. Along the way, we inserted these kind of Muse Court affordable units. This is 2 units in a rear lane, and this has been incredibly successful as well in terms of providing a lot of housing choice. Now, the other thing that I did was help to champion the infrastructure for this new model of urban design that was originally called traditional neighborhood development, but now it's called new urbanism. And we came up with this framework and said we also need to deliver the engineering and infrastructure in a way that doesn't work against our goals for walkability and connectivity. So we came up with a whole toolbox. We put this together, and this is basically the model for infrastructure and engineering for new urbanism that has become the model for all the development out there. So at the same time we were reforming the zoning ordinances, we were also working on reforming the stormwater management in a way that is woven in the community, versus saying these big asteroid craters you see with chain link fences around them that are very, very disruptive to community patterns. And then also one of my favorite local ones for Roanoke is this Roanoke City Market area redevelopment master plan. And I love the idea that you can come in when an area has kind of, in some ways, it hit bottom in the 1970s and 80s. They had taken the Civic Square and turned it into a parking lot, thinking that they had to compete with the malls and the strip shopping centers. Obviously, this didn't work. And so we then redesigned it as a people place, a civic square. And along the way, we had something like over 50 recommendations for ideas. Some of them were implemented. You never know which ones stick. You know, a couple that were wonderful is they took the city market building, and which was at that point looked more like a food court in a 1970s mall, with its kind of a back to the street. We turned it inside out and created outdoor community cafe space. You can see this kind of example of community life, cafe life. And then at the other end of the block, there was a big parking garage with its entrance ramp right as a terminated view of Market Street. We moved the entrance ramp to the parking garage around the corner and relined it with shops. It turned out to be a hotel lobby, and then built a Hampton Inn on top. So you never know, those were two huge successes, a lot of little things along the way. And this is a work in progress. There's still things that are evolving. You have to keep up, and good things are continuing to happen. Now, just a little background on the history of Roanoke. Roanoke is an amazing place. I love this image from 1891. Because you can see that the historic city was really a walkable village. And you can see this is the city market hall building, the former one that was on the site. Here's Hotel Roanoke up here. And then basically the original rail station. And then also, with Market Street coming down, instead of having, these kind of urban shop fronts, it was housing, mixed housing, attached housing, detached housing. A lot of housing choice, and it was really this village, civic uses like this church, and then some of the kind of urban patterns, but ultimately permeated throughout the downtown as new neighborhoods were planned adjacent that became their own walkable, self-contained neighborhoods. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about, because this really helps frame the missing middle. Missing middle is kind of more at the scale of the ingredients and the kind of housing that neighborhoods have, but the framework for how to do that came out of the early 20th century, at the beginning of the urban planning profession. There was a student at Harvard named John Nolan. I think he was like in the first graduating class. It was set up by the Olmsteds as a way to address huge growth in cities across the country at the time, and the idea that they needed to have more planning versus just being, just everything happening without much thought. Nolan went on to have an incredible career up through the 1930s and planned over 400 of these master plans, including 2 comprehensive plans for the city of Roanoke. In 1907, he actually did a comp plan while I think he was almost still in school, which apparently is the first official comprehensive plan in the country. So history has that legacy. He was inviting again back in 1928 to update it. And some of the things that he used for his framework are quite interesting. I grew up, Crystal Spring neighborhood was planned by John Nolan. When I moved to Charlotte, we settled in Myers Park, which is another beautiful neighborhood designed by John Nolan. You can see here this incredible tree canopy here, which is internationally famous for its kind of beautiful cathedral-like boulevards. The plans that Nolan did were very interesting. One of the things was a regional greenway plan, which it took until the 1990s to actually finally implement. And so we always say that good ideas never die. Sometimes they just take longer to implement. In this case, it was a great idea, and ultimately it just took a while to figure out at that monumental scale. But it's a great legacy. It's put Roanoke on the map in terms of one of the hiking destinations in the country because of its connections to greenways. The other thing that was interesting is his diagrams. These are some from the 1928 report that talked about neighborhoods. And what's interesting is these 2 diagrams that show these bubbles, these neighborhood bubbles, described that every neighborhood should have a park within a 15-minute walk, and also a neighborhood school, elementary school, within a 15-minute walk. And he was documenting the neighborhood, analyzing it from that scale, so that when he planned the expansions, it was on that increment of these walkable neighborhoods. You can see these little dots here showing these are the new centers, and how you start defining things that way. Now, this was something that was very important within the beginning of the planning profession, because this diagram here on the left is a famous diagram that was in all the planning textbooks in the 1920s. And it basically is called the neighborhood unit. And the neighborhood unit was basically a diagram that explained the ingredients that make up these walkable neighborhoods, a radius of 3/4 of a mile or 15-minute walk from edge to center. And I don't know, there's a new term, which is basically an old term, that's now called the 15-minute city. Well, a 15-minute city is the neighborhood unit. And people talk about that that's how we need to plan our cities and our communities. It's also interesting that when Nolan did the master plan for Crystal Spring, the neighborhood, it was designed on the neighborhood unit. You can see there's a center here. Everything kind of evolves because of topography and location, but the famous neighborhood green with the fire station and the shops, civic buildings dispersed here. Like there was originally a college here. Crystal Spring Elementary is right along in here. And this was an interesting place. It's where I grew up. And you can see that at that point I didn't realize it, but the quality of life that I was experiencing was really significant compared to perhaps other places in the country. What Nolan recommended was that the neighborhood unit be used for the plan of Roanoke. And so this became the model at that point. Obviously, we forgot about in the 1940s and 50s in the mid-20th century and started thinking more about cars. But now we're back to it. That kind of era of suburban experiment is really declining. It's happening before our eyes, and actually coming back and restoring the model of walkable neighborhoods. How do you do that? Well, there's some challenges, because one of the things about the development industry is we forgot how to do that. We forgot how to do anything besides single family suburban cookie cutter subdivisions and large apartment buildings that sometimes are called Texas donuts because they take a whole block up. In places like Charlotte, there are these types of developments everywhere, but there's none of this missing middle, which are basically all the housing choices that make up livability and community within our neighborhoods. These are similar in scale to single family houses, but they're side by side or stacked duplexes, 4-pack apartment houses, I call them, or fourplexes. It can come in sixplexes too. Courtyard buildings, cottage court, small clusters of small cottages around a common green, townhouses, these kind of like larger multi-family buildings, but they're not large, they're medium size and fit into the neighborhood. You can do interesting things like triple deckers or triplex, and then LiveWorks at the scale I showed you. These are the kind of things that really make a walkable traditional neighborhood, as opposed to just pods of this and that, which basically exclude a huge amount of the population and make it difficult to get around. Now, this is an interesting chart because it tracks that missing middle as a reference, this is actually, the missing middle was a phrase coined by Dan Perlich and his architectural firm that's Berkeley-based called Opticos. And he's a new urbanist, one of our colleagues. And while I was working on Light Imprint, he started championing this idea of the missing middle. So all these great ideas have come out of the movement. And to his credit, he's really put a lot of effort into this and made a huge difference. We're all kind of using this framework. The missing middle, starting in like 1920, that decade, all the way through the last decade, you can see how it started off well and then declined up right after World War II. And then it picked up again in the 1970s and 80s and then basically has declined ever since. What's interesting about the 70s and 80s is that all of the missing middle was actually built out in suburban sprawl. So basically the only way you could use it is if you were able to own and operate a car, and the costs associated with that, and the amount of infrastructure required to build it, and also the unintended consequences of things like air and water pollution, and the degradation of our natural and built environment. Just so many unintended consequences with that kind of original romance with the car. But you can see that these are examples that Opticos put together across the country in terms of examples of what these look like. You say, well, what does this really look like? Well, it looks like every traditional neighborhood from the 20th century, early 20th century, the duplexes, side by side and stacked, triplexes, townhouses like these in Georgetown, these small cottage courts. This is one out in California, pocket neighborhood, the courtyard buildings, these little 4-pack apartment houses, slightly, kind of medium apartment houses, and also the live works. You can see here, you live above the shop or beside the shop. There are all sorts of ways of doing these, but the idea is fine grain, and all of these are compatible with each other. So you can build them one next to the other, and you can build a duplex or a small apartment house on the same size lot as a regular kind of larger home. So it's very interchangeable. Now, Roanoke has some really amazing examples of some missing middle. These are from Old Southwest. These are some great apartment houses and apartment buildings from that early 20th century era, and these are quite beautiful. The architecture is exquisite. The detailing, the style, quality, kind of Italianate classical detailing, and quite remarkable. This one used to have porches that were enclosed, but for the most part, these are pretty intact, and they're just embedded in the neighborhood right next to lots of homes, and they provide that choice. This is where, folks like school teachers can live, municipal workers, and it's great. I lived in one of these in Charlotte for 4.5 years and loved it. What's nice about them is that the apartments aren't, kind of enclosed in, because you're only doing 2 apartments per floor. Every apartment has windows and doors and balconies and porches on 3 sides. So you get all this natural daylight, you get cross ventilation, you have a relationship with the streetscape, you have, basically a connection with the public realm and your neighbors. And basically it's affordable and does all sorts of good things like that. Here's some examples, maybe to a lesser architectural character, but a bunch of examples from the Elizabeth neighborhood in Charlotte, which you can see come in very similar forms. You can see how consistent they are in terms of some of the things they do well in terms of being good neighbors. Now, people say, well, you can't do those anymore. Well, that's what we're kind of coming back to. Clearly, we're doing this in all of our new urbanist communities. And here are just a few examples from some of my favorite projects that show you things like duplexes next to 6-pack apartments, these kind of narrow cottages, keeping the trees in Habersham, a wider cottage here. This is in Oklahoma. These are a pocket neighborhood of cottages, a mews court of small cottages, a cottage court. Here's another one in Cheshire, in Black Mountain. Great townhouses that are Savannah inspired in Habersham. These are 6-pack apartment houses here across the street from smaller cottages, and these great live works from Greensboro, and these great live works from, these are live work duplexes, and these are live work townhouses from Habersham. So you see, it's very achievable and actually incredibly successful and in demand. These are really some really interesting diagrams to explain the idea of how you can transition with missing middle housing between the kind of the core neighborhood that say maybe predominantly single family housing like this, and then as you extend out to the corridors along the edge, which are more commercial. And these types of building types, which are more dense and more attached, show how these types can do that well. And again, you look at examples in Roanoke and some of the historic neighborhoods. These are some great examples for people that live in Roanoke. You probably recognize these from where you live, but these are in neighborhoods like Wasena and Grandin Road and Raleigh Court and Crystal Spring You know, and you can see this is actually a cottage court in Salem that was designed amazingly by John Nolan. But these are mostly, the other ones are mostly in Roanoke, and again, offer this choice, which we need to really get back to in terms of supporting community. Now, the ingredients of these, the kind of kit of parts, is pretty consistent. Things like front porches really make a big difference in a neighborhood. It provides a place that people can connect with each other. They're socially inviting. And I love these images. This is from the Belmont neighborhood in Roanoke, of examples of how neighborhoods, this kind of front porch living, and how neighborhoods, they take their porches and they embellish them so that they're incredibly inviting, as a way to, you know, basically, if they can, you can invite neighbors in to sit on the porch and have discussions, continue to stay in contact with your neighbors and friends, which, you know, in terms of health conscious, and one of the most important things to be healthy are those social connections. And clearly this, in Belmont, it's almost like a competition. People are going out of the way to make these porches as inviting as possible. And this is the kind of thing that's naturally occurring and really makes a huge difference in terms of the bonds of community. Now, Southeast Roanoke has a lot of existing missing middle housing, these narrow cottages. This is accessory dwellings along a rear alley. This is a great live-work building that's lost its function. Shop downstairs, an apartment above, and then also some other businesses, some that are thriving, but a lot that are empty or need to basically kind of restore their connection with the neighborhood. There's great opportunity here, and this is where the missing middle housing is being restored by Restoration Housing. This is heroic work. Folks have no idea how difficult this is, but I just want to remind everyone that this work is incredibly important and is vital to actually restoring and supporting and our great walkable neighborhoods. The framework that the historic planners like John Nolan identified and said, this is how we create great neighbors and great neighborhoods. And so every neighborhood in Roanoke deserves this type of support, and the whole framework, all the ingredients of each neighborhood, including the missing middle, including mixed use, including daily needs nearby, all those things, front porches that are friendly and inviting, great streets that provide shade and walkability and multimodal opportunities, all those things, while within a 15-minute walk, are incredibly important. And this work is something that should be really, really brought to the forefront of how we are planning and supporting our neighborhoods. So thank you, and I wish Restoration Housing and all the neighborhoods in Roanoke great success, because I think the future is very bright.